AI, artificial intelligence, is already being put to use. It's already changing healthcare in subtle ways. It's changing it for patients, for hospitals, for hospital administration, everything from insurance verification to interpreting lab results, and supporting surgeons as well. So to help us understand this brave new world, we have an extraordinary conversation. Please welcome Adrienne Aoun, Dr. Suchi Saria, and Accenture's Julie Sweet. Thank you. There's some energy here. You've got the jacket. Hi.
Suchi.
Hi, Suchi. Hi, Julie. So I love the fact that we're about to begin a conversation about AI when in the green room, we had a couple of people bashing Alexa and talking about how it's not working right. And I order one thing and then I get something else. And so, and you were joking about the fact that people are worried about AI taking over the world, Adrienne, but in fact, we are far from that moment here.
Yeah, so I was using the example that, I was at Google before starting this company, and all the time people were getting scared of us, saying, oh God, I'm going to lose my job. AI is going to build robots that take us all out. And I'm sitting there trying to tell my Alexa to turn off the lights, and all of a sudden my blinds close, and I'm thinking, there's some mismatch going on here. What are we missing, right?
And it's funny, Julie, I think this is important because you were saying you can get Alexa to order you things, but if you give a specific parameter on that order, it just never works.
Today, at least.
Yeah.
Right? Now, do I have every expectation that will, evolve quickly?
Yeah.
And I do. And in fact, as we at Accenture look at tech trends over the last 30 years, I would tell you that the artificial intelligence has gone faster than any trend we've ever seen, right? And 2 years ago, if I had been on this stage saying what would be happening, we would not have predicted where we are today. Now I think as we get into the healthcare discussion, it's still earlier stages than some other industries which are farther ahead, and that's very relevant for this audience. But I would not bet against Alexa or how quickly artificial intelligence is evolving.
No, I'm sure that just even the comments that I've had, Alexa has turned off all of the gas in our home and electricity. It's already heard everything I've said. Suchi, when we think about what doctoring is, what medicine is, much of it is drawing inferences from measurable real-world data, from observable real-world data. That's the kind of thing that you think machines can do and do. And you've put that to work, haven't you?
Sure. Yeah, so I think, one way to think about sort of putting Adrienne's comment in context is that, historically in medicine, we've had, what looks like rule-based systems that say, when heart rate is above 120 and when blood pressure behaves this way, then do X. And that makes a lot of sense, especially in areas where we already know this to be true. But as more and more high volume, high throughput, especially data through electronic health records that are getting collected and being accessible, there's an opportunity to go beyond and learn from the data, to learn much richer patient-specific context where, the reason, I see the fact that their heart rate, blood pressure sort of vary, not a whole lot, but in concert just enough to kind of tick me off that this person might be at risk of deteriorating. Mm-hmm. And then those are the kinds of new capabilities that are now becoming possible that we didn't have before.
And just to follow up on this, we heard from an earlier speaker about the ability of AI to tell us some risk assessments of sepsis, for example. And this is something that you've actually put to work in identifying. And this is, sepsis is the 11th biggest killer in the US. It's a serious disease, septic shock.
Yeah, so I think, I guess I'll frame and sort of give you an example, which is about, for a long time, I would say like 4 to 5 years ago, up until 3 years ago, there was still sort of this belief that let's invest in more diagnostics of the kind where you're running a little assay of sorts, where when the physician is suspicious, they go run this diagnostic test. It allows you to measure some marker in the blood that then tells you that this person's septic. and then you might go figure out which antibiotic to give. For example, though most physicians pre-treat because they're suspecting. The challenge is you often don't know, like, by the time you're seeing signs and symptoms where you're suspecting to run that diagnostic, it might be too late. And being able to run systems that are doing surveillance in the background in order to be able to understand who are the individuals at risk is sort of shifts you away from this reactive to proactive. The challenge, on the other hand, is sort of moving back to kind of the Alexa analogy here is, I think there is this version of trying to, sort of risk scores are a very big umbrella term, and going from like, what used to be historical risk scores to in context diagnostic grade tools that are driven by AI, I think is a very serious sort of gap that we have to close. And that is not to be taken lightly in a way that I think there's a lot of excitement now, but there's also some amount of like brushing the very important details under the rug and sort of
And I know this is something, Adrian, so how are you incorporating AI into Forward? And tell people a little bit about the operation you run.
So let me kind of take a step back and maybe disagree respectfully with Julie over here, where I would bet any day of the week against Alexa. I think that we're making a fairly large mistake when we look at kind of the progression of AI, right? We go from humans doing something to all of a sudden overnight, let's fully automate it. There's an enormous leap in there, right? So when we think of autonomous cars, there were a bunch of stages in middle in which we made humans superhumans, right? You can't see at night very well, so we created headlights. You're not really good at hitting the brakes super well, so we created anti-lock brakes, right? We created cruise control. We worked our way up towards this. So in the world of healthcare, doctors, they're still in that kind of old world where we haven't given them the anti-lock brakes. I think of doctors a lot as the free climbers of our day, right? And let's just start by getting their backs. Let's start by building them really good tools. So I wouldn't go up to one of my software engineers and ask them to build me a website, but not hand them a laptop. But for some reason, I think it's totally okay to go up to a doctor and say, save my life, and then I hand them a stethoscope? How does that make any sense, right? So what we're doing at Forward is we're building doctors' offices where we're technology enabled. We're giving them all the modern tools that they've been asking for a while. So what's great about us is we've got engineers and we've got doctors, and every single day they're working together. And once they start working together, you get products like a body scanner. You get these interactive screens with a model of your body and everything we've learned about them overlaid. You got stethoscopes that visualize on the screen and can analyze the waveforms. And so by doing this, we start to inch towards that Alexa world, but I still think we're pretty far off from that.
So Julie, I've known you for a number of years, and you're one of the most sophisticated observers of what's actually happening in the real world in terms of business. And so you see where the money's going. You do a lot of that investing. Where is the investment money going, and what's real and what isn't?
Well, first, let's maybe build up what Adrian's saying, because I think it's important that AI not be a discussion, because I don't define the Alexa world as being sort of the robotic world. And I think there's too many discussions that are sort of polarized, right, between humans and robots taking over the world. And in fact, what we believe and what we're seeing is that it's about humans being augmented by machines or artificial learning. And I actually talk about the 3 A's, automation, analytics, artificial intelligence. Virtually none of these solutions are purely any of those things, except when you're really getting at just automating processes. So Adrian, what you're doing is really augmenting humans. And we talk a lot about, when we're talking with companies, that we will live in a world that moves from workforce planning, which is about FTEs, to task planning. And you're really, really planning what tasks should machines do and what should humans do. And in fact, we often will talk about making humans giving humans superpowers, through machine learning. And so what we are seeing today, and again, it's very different in different industries, but if you look at healthcare, first of all, there's a pilot or a startup in virtually every aspect of healthcare. So when you look ahead and say, will technology completely disrupt healthcare? We would say yes. But it's very different to say we've got pilots and startups to sort of see what's in the near term, what's out. So what's happening now is we're seeing automation in processes in basic care management, nurses running call centers with sort of automated processes to help them processing claims, sort of basic administrative functions. Then the other big category that we're seeing kind of across the board is using artificial intelligence and analytics to identify patients. That's everything from the pharmaceutical company that's trying to find more undiagnosed patients for their drug, to the medical device company that we help build an analytics platform to help identify patients at risk of cardiovascular disease who would be undiagnosed in the hospital setting and then provide services to them. We're working with Roche on an analytics platform around diabetes, which is more on the side of intervention, which is really the third place we're seeing is early, more like pilots or very early entrance into care intervention around chronic diseases in particular. That's kind of what we're seeing today. But as we look forward, and this is very much what you said, Suchi, we're seeing investment. Venture capital is always the great place to kind of look, and we're seeing that in a lot of things around productivity and efficiencies, and much less in diagnostics, which is a much higher risk.
Yeah, so a lot of this is making the systems work better. You know, that's the non-sexy stuff in, you know, at least to the outside world. Of course, for organizations and enterprises, this is critical. In terms of identifying individuals, though, who are either at risk or who might be good candidates for a new drug, or what are the training sets that we use on AI right now to get us smarter, Suchi?
Sure. So let me just clarify that language of like, you mean training set, you mean to develop the AI product.
To develop machine learning tools that, you know, so in other words, we have to start with some data that we're pretty confident about and then use that to train machines to make inferences, for example.
Yeah, sure. I can actually talk a little bit about, say, for example, using our work in sepsis as an example, where we've sort of gone pretty far down the line in this area. And so, like, classically, I don't, you know, if, like, the way people typically talk about machine learning is it's teaching machines how to, you know, do something by reverse engineering the logic once you know what the truth is. So in a common example people use is if you have an image and somebody's told you which images contain, like, images of, like, you know, tumors versus non-tumors, and you had millions of such examples, then maybe you could get a machine to try to reverse engineer, like, what about the image makes it look like a tumor versus a non-tumor? So that's the most classical, commonly used version of AI right now that people in industry are talking about. You know, if you step back a little bit, sort of the more larger world of, like, I'm also a professor, I teach advanced machine learning, and in that world, we work a lot more with where you don't have access to, say, 1 million or 10 million images, but you could have what's called like a combination of cues or a combination of supervision, if you will. So an example might be, you may have small set of like gold standard data, but a large set of what looks like approximately true data. And so what you're doing is starting from here to learn approximate rules, then you then work with a physician in the loop or an expert in the loop to help you correct where the mistakes might be. And when you do that, you can bootstrap your way up much, much faster than having required that you started with 10 million images. So a great example of this is trying to collect 10 million examples of patients that are exactly identified as when they have sepsis is very hard. But we've, you know, now shown in up to 400,000 cases of nearly gold standard data, but it's taken us 3 years in this bootstrapped way of getting up there. And the importance of doing, though, is that the classical way that people think about it is, well, I need a ton of examples. Why don't I download data with ICD-9 codes or billing codes? That's a very common practice in industry right now, where you take historical data, somebody's been coded for sepsis, you take those coded examples, you reverse engineer what about them. The challenge with that is, billing codes are very non-sensitive and non-specific. They're being billed doesn't mean they actually had the condition. So what you end up getting is a little bit of garbage in, garbage out. So right. I think all to say that there's a little bit of nuance in our, to doing it well and expanding the repertoire.
So in a second, I'm going to open up this conversation to the audience here, and so I'd love you to think about your questions now and let our runners know. But this phrase, real world data, keeps coming back up in conversation after conversation here. And of course, there's this great divide in the medical and scientific community between real world data and gold standard data, however that's defined. But we got to measure this stuff, right? So what are you, Adrian, in your forward operation, how are you making sure that the care you're giving with these new enhanced tools is actually better than the other stuff?
Yeah, so we always start with our own data because exactly to your point, when we started the company, we obviously started and said, well, great, we'll just go get a bunch of data sets, train some models, and we'll be done. Mm-hmm. But the truth is that the existing data sets, while large, are often in a terrible format, right? They're a point in time as opposed to a continuous operation of kind of following what happened to a person. They're obviously biased by the doctor themselves. It's an inherent truth, right? They're mostly built for the purposes of billing, not for the purposes of care. So then we said, okay, how can we get to a world, thinking back again to kind of my Google example, well, when Google wants to tweak the search engine, they don't go hire a bunch of people to do some fake searches. They just kind of put it out there, and they see what it does on their own population, right? So they've got 3 billion users using them every single day, all in some form of kind of test. And so you want to get to a world whereby healthcare is done the same way, because that's going to be the best data. Mm-hmm. So then we said, okay, well, let's start it, and let's start collecting all of this information internally. Now, the good news is that you can actually benchmark how you're performing in terms of outcomes against other systems because there's some standards. The bad news is these standards are very old, and they're based on not having a lot of good information. So outcome measures, which is what everybody in healthcare talks about all the time, it's actually kind of a misnomer, because when you go look at the standards people use, whether it's the HEDIS scores, whether it's some of these ACO metrics, unfortunately, they don't often know. You go to the doctor, they say, okay, I don't know, you have a cold. They code it, you leave. Well, did you have a cold? Did you not have a cold? Did it get better? Did it not get better? We don't actually know. So we can't measure that in the traditional healthcare system. What we can measure is a lot of what are known as intermediate metrics, right? So these are things like, did your doctor actually recommend a breast exam or not? Did your population get colonoscopies or not? Because we think these are good indicators. So at Forward, we're measuring those on a daily basis against the existing healthcare system. But we actually want to move to a world where everybody's looking at actual outcome measures. Everybody follows you home, understands, did you get better, did you not, and stays on top of things, because then everybody will be targeting the right metrics.
Let me see if we've got a question or comment from here. Anybody? Oh, okay. One of the big issues, Julie, is cost. Everyone is worried about it, particularly in the healthcare system. Where is AI, or where do you see the potential of AI for reducing costs throughout the system?
Well, it's a great point, and it isn't as exciting as diagnostics around sepsis or breast cancer or all those things, but we actually believe it's probably the most impactful we can have for patients, and for not just patients, but more importantly, keeping people out. I mean, if you look at costs today, no matter what country in the world, healthcare costs grow 1% to 3% above GDP. So it doesn't matter what the base is, and that's because it's mostly human, right? And we are actually predicting a major gap in clinicians by 2030. 100,000 doctors in the U.S., over 12 million globally. So where we see AI really being able to play an important role is to increase productivity, which means needing less people, and to closing the gap on the clinician gap through things like, there's AI already being used for self-care, being able to help when do you need self-diagnosis, when do you need to go into the doctor or not. Our research shows that 20% of the clinician gap that's estimated in the US could be closed by AI. So it's a really powerful when you think about costs, quality of care, and access.
Yeah, and please.
Yeah, let me add sort of a concrete example to that ties into both sort of the previous question. So, like, for example, like one of the interesting experiments we did was, as we've developed sort of this AI-driven, real-time patient assessment that's now being provided in the loop for sepsis, or patients at risk for sepsis that's being provided to caregivers throughout, so this is within the Hopkins healthcare system. So in a 300-bed hospital, when we deployed this, one thing we saw that was interesting was we saw basically, historically, over 35% of patients were getting treatment more than 2 hours after when they should have, versus now, 92% of them were getting it, within an hour of, first being like early detected as likely at risk. Second, the amount of time that historically it used to take them to review a case would look something like 20 minutes, depending on the team, and then there's care coordination, et cetera, 20 to 30 minutes, depending on the case, and now it's gone down to under a minute, where they can, because it surfaces all the information right then and there, they know what to look at, they can quickly close the case, so there are more people getting the right care in much shorter amount of time. And then the third, most importantly, is the skills gap. So for instance, earlier we just heard a talk about nursing turnover. So in our example, we didn't even have nurses initially participate. When they sort of looked at the workflow, they started seeing patients flagged. Automatically, they created a workflow where they were pulling patients out of the waiting room. Suddenly, they were clicking in to see why, what about this patient made them aberrant, going and doing an analysis, pulling them into the Swift lane so they get an assessment faster, which basically means suddenly there's like automatic education going on in terms of sort of the context here.
And that speaks to both workflow and cost and, of course, better patients.
Yeah.
We've got a question back there. Yeah, we have one there, and then we only have 3.5 minutes, yeah.
Hi, Phil Polikoff, Stanford University. Might you comment on the American Academy of Internal Medicine put forth critical choices many years ago on evidence-based medicine? Recently, the Health Affairs had a conference on this issue, and the pin-up on this has been negligible. That you have all this data on what's right to do, the 5 things that you should do based on evidence-based medicine or not do, and the pickup from the practitioners has been slim to none.
Anybody want to respond to that, or?
Yeah, so the way we think about this at Forward is that asking clinicians to pick things up was the wrong approach anyway, right? So in Forward, we just make it really easy to do the right thing. If you have 5 things that you want to be done, put them on the screen and let a doctor click a box, right? The problem right now is that you're asking these frontline clinicians to memorize and remember an insane amount of information on a daily basis. And that's just not realistic, right? So it's the same way that we see, pilots with their checklists, let's just do that, except those checklists should be very nice, clean user interfaces where they click a button and it does it for them.
All right, we have one quick question here, and yeah, quick.
Amy Compton Phillips, Providence St. Joseph Health. Hi. And quick question around, I'm very simplistic as a physician. I think about, there's data in, and then you apply AI algorithms, and then there's some kind of assisted action out, right? And the place where we see a lot of pain at the moment is very different than Google. It's the data in aspect, and that we have a lock on these EMRs that is our fundamental tool by where we acquire information. And wonder how AI might help disrupt that market so that we can have better tools to get the data in the first place to then apply the algorithms.
I can speak a little bit to that, but go ahead. So there is sort of, there's like a class of technologies in computer science called data wrangling, where basically the idea is rather than coming up with rules-based mapping where you say, some data is coming out and hard-coded, if this is coming out, then this is what it means. Instead, you sort of learn you approximately map and then you learn the mappings. And the whole idea is you're kind of learning like a dictionary of what an intelligent human would have done there to say, oh, I see, this drug is offered in like milliliters per keg, but here it's grams per cc. And so you can do the transformation on the go in order for the mapping to be correct. And historically in healthcare, we've relied a lot on standards, where we hard code and pre-specify upfront what everybody ought to be doing with the data in order to get the data out. But I think increasingly industry is moving towards, or these principles being brought to bear, where you have data coming out in some format that is not exactly 100%, it's loose format, if you will, like FHIR. And then the question is of, kind of doing the intelligent mapping on the fly.
Yeah, I mean, I think the good news is, right, is that data is the fuel for AI. And there's a lot of work done, and you cannot have an AI strategy unless you understand data. And there's a lot of work being done both on the regulatory front and the technology front to actually be able to harness this data. And that's why, as we look forward, we're very optimistic, but there is real work to be done, but a ton of focus, because it is the fuel for AI.
Fantastic. Thank you. Great conversation, Julie, Suchi, Adrienne. I wish we could keep talking. Thank you very much.
Thank you.